Dr. Wiseman?
Yes.
On our paper, can we use more than one of the greases?
That would make your paper more diffuse than you need. I think there's enough to do just focusing on one. There's no reason why you can't bring in something from one of the other greases to illustrate a point. But I would like the focus to be on one of them. That way the paper will have greater unity. Yes, Ms. Harris.
What if you feel like the issue that you're referring to is a combination of two of the greases, like government and economics, both of them together?
Well, I'll be interested in how you weave them together, but you still have to have one as an emphasis. Right. And of course, a lot of these circumstances do convolute one into the other. And so you may not find yourself being able to limit yourself to those 50 pages. You might have to refer to something at the end, but I do want you to focus and to give me a tightly written paper. Yes.
Also, do you consider philosophy part of religion, or do you not consider it part of the greases at all?
Philosophy would probably come under religion or aesthetics, whichever aspect you want to look at. Good question. Let's look at the Rake's Progress one more time. I want to show you how whimsical Hogarth can be. Notice the wings at the top of this plate. These are the wings of Icarus. As having flown high and having had his fortune, now he's fallen into this desperate situation where he is in Newgate prison. He has enough money, you see, to have his own apartment. And he has enough money where he's allowed to bring guests in, although he's not happy with the guests he has. If he wants food, he has to pay extra. If he wants coal in his furnace in the winter, he has to pay extra. There are a lot of people who died in Newgate prison, or people died because they had neither heat in the winter. Some were in the cellar where you could hear the lice crack when they walked back and forth. That's how dirty the place was. This was not a good place to be, no matter what circumstances you were in. But Rakewell, we saw, who has gone from having all this money and all this riches, all this wealth, all this fortune, now has been arrested. He finally is suffering from depression or mental illness, and he ends up in Bedlam. Bethlehem Hospital is, if you say Bethlehem very quickly, it becomes Bethlehem, Bedlam, Bedlam. And this is Bedlam where he is. And here he is, naked, chained, lying in a state of helplessness, because this is where his dissolute life has led him. You see, there he is. And the jailers are trying to take care of him. His wig is off. Chains are on his feet to keep him from hurting anyone else. Here's a man who thinks he's Galileo. He's looking through a microscope. Here's a man who has a crown on his head and a scepter of sorts, thinking he's the king of the world. Here are two women confined to Bedlam who are walking up and down the halls as they walked up and down the streets of London. Here is someone who is a religious fanatic, who's mourning in his cell with a crucifix behind him. But this is the end of the Rake's Progress. This is where he has progressed, and he can get no further than Bedlam, where, like other madmen, he is doomed the rest of his life to live and to die. Fortunately, we have a different story for Moll Flanders, because this is a study of Pilgrims Progress. This is a woman pilgrim who goes through the vicissitudes of life and who emerges with her self-respect, with property, with a husband, with estate, in a new world. And you may in fact want to draw the analogy that America is the new world, that America is the heaven that England has not been. Let's talk now a little bit more about the economic factor in Moll Flanders. Moll Flanders, we know, takes her name Moll, which is a popular name for any woman of low status. There was a famous pickpocket in England by the name of Mary Godson, Godson, whose alias was Moll King. John Richetti, who's written about Defoe's narratives, that's Richetti, says that the affair with Jemmy is a synthesis of sexuality and profit. They're going to enjoy each other's company, and they're both going to profit from it, both materially and ultimately spiritually. Moll Flanders, we know, loses her profit, and this profit we've been talking about, when she steals 2 pieces of brocaded silk from the home of a man who acts as a broker between weavers and mercers in the sale of woolen goods. Finally, we see her sailing for North Carolina, and the whole apparatus indicates that she has been able to sequester enough wealth that she can bribe the captain of the ship to give both Jemmy and her fine quarters, and she ends up in America with 2 servants, an English woman servant who's just come on shore from a ship at Liverpool, and a Negro manservant. Says Moll Flanders, these things are absolutely necessary for all people that pretended to settle in that country. And she discovers that her mother has left her this estate, which she tries to keep from her husband. And the end of the novel, of course, is somewhat entertaining in that Moll Flanders has to apprise her husband of the wealth she has, but wants to keep from him the fact that she has another family and that her mother in America has left this estate to her, since she enjoys riches at the end of the novel. Let's talk about A among the Greases, art and aesthetics. We can put this on the screen. I'll have to zoom down, zoom out. All right. Number one, there are a number of ways we can look at art and aesthetics in this particular book, and I'll deal with them in just a second. Moll obtains, the eldest brother, we know at one point in the novel, has the best wig, the best hat, and the best sword to meet his betrothed. Now, this would be a sign of aesthetics, because how do you design a wig? A wig has to come from real hair, and we do know that the barbers in the 18th century, at this time, Defoe in 1722, were still part of the Surgeon and Barbers Guild. It wasn't until later, around 1740, that the Barber and the Surgeons Guild split. So making wigs was an art. Most people shaved their heads as a way to keep license. They didn't take baths, but perhaps once a year. It would be difficult to keep your hair from not harboring insects or various types of diseases. So you would wear wigs as a way of cleansing yourself. The eldest brother had the best wig, the best hat, and the best sword to meet his betrothed. When he knows he's not going to marry Moll Flanders, he does go to meet this woman with his elegance, and so this would be a sign of art and aesthetics. Moll herself obtains a hood, a mask, a fan, and a pair of gloves. So again, you have the kind of dress that people would wear in the 18th century, and this becomes of some interest. Let's look at the poetry reading seen on page 63. When you deal with art and aesthetics, it's kind of an interesting piece, and I'd like to look at it for a few moments. All right. Here she's posing to gain money from a captain, and they start to write poetry to each other. So the art of writing poetry becomes one of the ways that one plays the love game. Says Moll Flanders on page 62, this being my case, I, who had a subtle game to play, had nothing now to do but to single out from them all the properest man that might be for my purpose. That is to say, the man who is most likely to depend upon the hearsay of a fortune. She's posing as a captain's widow who has a great deal of money trying to attract a man. This was my man. And one morning he pulls off his diamond ring and writes upon the glass of the sash in my chamber this line, "You I love, and you alone." And your note tells you that people commonly would take even diamond-tipped pencils and would write on glass, carve their initials into glass. "You I love, and you alone." I read it and asked him to lend me his ring, with which I wrote under it thus, "And so in love says everyone." He takes his ring again and writes another line thus, "Virtue alone is an estate." I borrowed it again and I wrote under it, "But money is virtue, gold is fate." So the whole poem reads, "You I love and you alone, and so in love says everyone. Virtue alone is an estate, but money is virtue, gold is fate." She says, "He colored as red as fire to see me turn so quick upon him." That is, she's very clever. She can answer him line for line in this witty repartee. "He colored as red as fire to see me turn so quick upon him, and in a kind of rage told me he would conquer me," and writes again thus. So their conquest is being told in this poetry writing session. He writes, "I scorn your gold, and yet I love." I ventured all upon the last cast of poetry, as you'll see, for I wrote boldly under his, "I'm poor. Let's see how kind you'll prove." Now, he's not going to believe that she's poor. He thinks it's part of the poetry game. This, she says, was a sad truth to me. Whether he believed me or no, I could not tell. I suppose then he did not. However, he flew to me, took me in his arms, and kissing me very eagerly and with the greatest passion imaginable, he held me fast till he called for a pen and ink, and then told me he could not wait the tedious writing on the glass, but pulling out a piece of paper he began and wrote again, "Be mine with all your poverty." I took his pen and followed him immediately, thus, yet secretly, "You hope I lie." And so he says, "I'll take you no matter what you are." And she says, "Well, but I know you really want me to have some money." And he says, "Let love alone be our debate." And she says, she loves again that does not debate, that does not hate. She loves again that does not hate. Well, of course, they marry, but what do we discover? He is her brother, right? And so the marriage has to end. And so this rather... All right, here's something that's very interesting in this particular piece. They have this quick, ready repartee, and one of the reasons they're equal is because they are equal. And I'm not sure that Defoe really was saying that, but it does turn out that she's his match. And then when they get to America, and they have 2 sons in America, and she's pregnant with a third, right? Then she meets his mother. And his mother starts talking about how she came to America and what her circumstances were before. And then when her mother utters her name, then Moll Flanders knows all is lost. And then enters a very interesting point of intrigue where Moll Flanders has to tell the mother. And the mother and Moll both plan together not to tell the husband. But then Moll has this act of conscience, and she has to tell it. So Defoe has the ability. So not only do we have a poem that tells a story, not only do we recognize that you can express yourself in words, but Defoe, expressing himself in words, now has his characters expressing themselves in words, and you have an example of the art and aesthetics of the literary craft being told when you're studying Moll Flanders. And you see the artist at work. And to some extent he's saying that not only must you write, but you must write fast. Yes, sir.
Is she more concerned with natural law? As she's, the incest bothers her. It bothers her conscience, but she has no problem with any kind of, human law or God's law.
The incest is the worst breach of the 10 Commandments. That is, not only are you not to commit adultery, but to discover that you've committed adultery with your own kind is the ultimate breach. And Defoe nor anyone could have sustained that. Incest is really a very basic taboo. Freud uses the Oedipus complex in showing that this is the ultimate sin one commits, engaged in incest. All the Gothic novelists, or most of the Gothic novelists at the end of the 18th century, used incest as a common theme. And in Lewis's The Monk, where a monk is about to seduce a woman and looks at her and thinks that she might be his own daughter. Or in Anne Radcliffe's Italian, an evil man, dressed in monk's clothing, looks at a woman, is about to seduce her, and realizes by the locket around her neck that she might be his daughter, and refuses to do it. You see, the act of incest is the ultimate act of sin that one commits. And so, once Moll Flanders has discovered this. Now, why Defoe puts it in a novel, why Defoe decides that she should be guilty of the most heinous sin one can commit, only suggests a proper rationale for her departure from America to continue the adventure. But it is the natural law that has been violated, and the religious law. I mean, where she has slept with him, she's had 3 children by him, and she's pregnant with one of them, and then discovers that she can't even bear to be in bed with him. She says, I can't even slip between the sheets with him anymore. We have not necessarily the sense of the spiritual, but she's not talking about God, but about the natural law. All right, so in this particular episode, as I was saying, we are dealing with art. We are dealing with the idea that the individual herself is able to create as Defoe has created. Now, the fact that they're writing very rapidly on the window pane with diamonds wouldn't be at all odd to Defoe, because he wrote extremely rapidly. He wrote so rapidly that if you read a full-length book of his and then looked at reports in the newspapers just 2 weeks earlier, or even a week earlier, you would find elements from his own notes from these newspapers in the novels he wrote. We have evidence that's how fast he was writing. And so to see ideas come rapidly on the window pane glass, which is really a very interesting scene, is understandable if you know how fast Defoe wrote and how fast he thought people could think. We have another example of, on page 63, where in page 63, where the tool, where the diamond is a symbol for sexual infighting, we have a very interesting juxtaposition. Actually, it's a love scene where they're writing on glass, they're exchanging ideas, they're challenging each other. They're both winning with each other, and I would say that this would be a metaphor and a very interesting love match. If you turn to page 119, you see that Jemmy writes letters too. A lot of these people are letter writers, and this becomes part of the aesthetic situation. On page 119, we have his letter. He has to leave her. They realize that they've both pulled the scam, and he's got to go to Ireland to look at it for his fortune. And he writes this letter: "My dear, I am a dog. I have abused you, but I have been drawn in to do it by a base creature, contrary to my principle and the general practice of my life. Forgive me, my dear. I ask you pardon with the greatest sincerity. I am the most miserable of men in having deluded you. I have been so happy to possess you, and am now so wretched as to be forced to fly from you. Forgive me, my dear. Once more I say, forgive me. I am not able to see you ruined by me, and myself unable to support you. Our marriage is nothing. I shall never be able to see you again. I here discharge you from it. If you can marry to your advantage, do not decline it on my account. I here swear to you on my faith and on the word of a man of honor, I will never disturb your repose if I should know of it, which, however, is not likely. On the other hand, if you should not marry, and if good fortune should befall me, it shall be all yours wherever you are." He writes an elegant letter, right? For a highwayman, for a crook, for a rake, for a scam artist. But this, of course, again, is an aesthetic statement. How do you write a letter where you express your departure from your lover, the honor you hold for her, and your ultimate expectation of a rapprochement? And indeed, when they meet together in prison, and Moll Flanders actually saves Jemmy from the hangman's noose by bribing the jailer, then his letter becomes meaningful. Page 214, another aesthetic moment where we see Moll's appearance at Newgate prison when she's in jail. She says, and we get an idea that this is a non-aesthetic place. She says, "I looked on myself as lost," top of page 214. "And that I had nothing to think of but of going out of the world, and with that the utmost infamy. The hellish noise, the roaring, swearing, and clamor, the stench and nastiness, and all the dreadful crowd of afflicting things I saw there joined together to make the place seem an emblem of hell itself, and a kind of entrance into it." So this is what is non-aesthetic, what is cacophonous, what is disjunctive, what is disparate, what is the opposite of harmony and unity and peace. And she says we're not in hell, but we are moving in that direction. She says at the bottom of the page, "Oh, if I had but been sent to any place in the world, and not to Newgate, I should have thought myself happy. Moving on in the Greases, and you may find more. By the way, if I'm skipping over some that you yourself have acknowledged, why don't you mention to me, and we can talk about it briefly. Under Science and Technology, you could probably find a lot of elements, but number one on page 15, we have the spinet and the harpsichord that she's learning to play. On page 49, when she sells herself to a rake in a rich coach, remember, he falls asleep in the coach. The man has horses, a coachman, a postilion, 2 footmen in good liveries, a gentleman on a horseback, and a page with a feather in his hat, and she steals from him and slips off out of the stagecoach. And she knows she's going to get away with it because she says the man would never tell his wife or his family that he had picked up a prostitute and that he was going to stay with her. And in terms of science and engineering, Jemmy chooses to attempt a farm in Ireland. And so farming and the management of a farm is one of our concerns under science and engineering. The 18th century, of course, is the period of the Industrial Revolution. And while we don't have it at this point, in 1722, by the 1745, you already had the steam engine, the spinning jenny, various other devices for plowing the land and for seeding the land. Toward the end of the 18th century, George III already had experimental farms. Throughout England, people were digging up the soil and planting tiles under the soil for drainage. And even today, when you go to parts of England, even in the winter, the grass looks as green as it in the summer because the runoff through these tiles in the 18th century still works. So you find a lot of evidence in this in Moll Flanders. Under the field of education, let's put that on the screen in a moment. Yes. Can we put that on the screen? All right. With the mayor's family, Moll learns French, writing and music, and at the age of 48, she turns to crime. And let's move into social behavior, where we have a different type of kinship. The kinship in social behavior is an interesting statement. What kind of family does Moll Flanders have in this novel? There is a kinship or sexual exchange. She has a biological family and a nuclear family. The older brother kisses her, embraces her, page 18. Page 21, Moll recognizes what happened by giving in too soon. She recognizes the loss of her virtue and the advantage that she has now in having possession of the older brother. Page 25, she says, I saw the cloud, though I did not foresee the storm. And she discovers this truth, that the elder brother pleads that they shall always be friends, even when he knows that they are not going to be husband and wife. So throughout this novel, in terms of social behavior, there's always a sexual exchange. What she has to offer and what she's going to receive in turn for it, and that becomes part of the problem. Now, if you look again on this chart, Moll objects to the double standard in society. You find that on page 54, and I'd like to look at that briefly. She says, and those who are following a feminist credo might follow that on page 54. She says, on the other hand, as the market run very unhappily on the men's side, I found the women had lost the privilege of saying no. It was a favor for a woman to have the question asked. Obviously, do you want to make love? And if any young lady had so much arrogance as to counterfeit a negative, to pretend that she wanted to say no, she never had the opportunity given her of denying twice. If you denied him once, he would forsake you, and you wouldn't have the benefit of his riches, you wouldn't have the benefit of his family, you wouldn't have the benefit of his marriage. And that they carried it so high, these men, that a woman was scarce allowed to inquire after the character or estate of the person that pretended to her. That is, these men would force themselves on the woman. They wouldn't even give the woman the right, the opportunity to find out who they were, what their status was, what their privileges was. They wouldn't accept no for an answer. The men had such a choice everywhere, that the case of the women was very unhappy, for they seemed to ply at every door, and if the man was by great chance refused the one house, he was sure to be received at the next. So here she is objecting to the double standard of men in society and women. And it's on page 69, when she's talking to her mother, that her mother tells her that the past is prologue in America. You look on page 69. She says, her mother tells Moll Flanders, hence, child, says she, many a Newgate bird becomes a great man. Many a Newgate bird becomes a great man in America. And we have, continued she, several justices of the peace, officers of the train bands, and magistrates of the town that have been burnt in the hand. Criminals would be branded, and in America, now some of the mayors and some of the leading figures in town were those who had been branded earlier. Says her mother, continuing, America is a land of opportunity. She says, I told you some of the best men in this country are burnt in the hand, and they are not ashamed to own it. There's Major so-and-so, says she. He was an eminent pickpocket. And there's Justice, he was a shoplifter. And both of them were burnt in the hand. So when we move into this issue of social behavior, we discover a number of issues posing themselves that America offers opportunity for people who started out life as a criminal. We've already mentioned the marriage, Moll Flanders' marriage to her brother, which violates the incest taboo, and Moll's expression of horror at her consanguineous relationship to her husband. Her mother urges secrecy. Humphrey is not to know, but ultimately Moll Flanders reveals the secret. Later on, when Moll has returned to England, about 2 pages later, we find that she finds herself at Bath. But Bath is not a place, it's a summer resort. It's Miami Beach. Bath is not the place to get husbands. Men look for mistresses, but not for a wife at Bath, says Moll Flanders. On page 89, under the category of social behavior, we find that Moll realizes she has lived in open, avowed incest and whoredom, and she's horrified at her existence. And finally, I'm going to move quickly to page 101, where on page 98, of course, is the incest theme. She could not bear the thought of coming between the sheets with him. I mentioned that before. And page 101 is the plight of woman. So let's look at page 101 and read what Daniel Defoe says there about the plight of women in modern English society. When a woman, he says, is thus left desolate and void of counsel, she is just like a bag of money or a jewel dropped on the highway, which is a prey to the next comer. And the first full paragraph on page 101. If a man of virtue and upright principles happens to find it, he will have it cried, and the owner may come to hear of it again. But how many times shall such a thing fall into hands that will make no scruple of seizing it for their own, to once that it shall come into good hands? Most people will use it and abuse it as she has been used and abused. What is her hope, she says? This was evidently my case. For I was now a loose, unguided creature, and had no help, no assistance, no guide for my conduct. I knew what I aimed at and what I wanted, but knew nothing how to pursue the end by direct means. I wanted to be placed in a settled state of living, and had I happened to meet with a sober, good husband, I should have been as faithful and true a wife to him as virtue itself could have formed. Now, Moll Flanders is, I think, a formidable novel. There are a number of things we can say about it yet. And there are some key points that you may want to raise when you discuss Moll Flanders. First, of course, is can you trace her behavior to the circumstances of her birth? Are we going to say that? Today we may have a different picture, but in the 18th century, people very strongly felt that a person's birth was the prediction of one's future. Second, we know that Moll's subsequent marriages indicate her continual search for security. And the truth is that she can only marry Jamie when she does know that she's going to be secure with him. Third, we know that Moll's career flourishes even when the need for her to steal diminishes, because she is acquisitive. Not inquisitive, but acquisitive. She must have more and more and more because she's afraid of having less and less. And since she always loses so much, whatever she has is never to her advantage. Fourth point, we may say that Moll is naturally good. She desires to be a lady. She desires to be virtuous. She does reject her brother. She does recognize the guilt on her conscience in certain circumstances. And number 6, we know that she's related to the world in which she lives. Number 5, oh. All right, number 5 tells us that the stigma attached to her criminal acts is a rationalization for being criminal. That is, she knows what she does is bad, but she can't help doing it. But as long as she knows it's bad, then she has the capability to do good. This is an example of evil growing out of good, or good growing out of evil. As long as she commits these acts, she can rationalize her doing them as evil, and then can recognize that the opposite virtue is what she ultimately will own or desire. Kind of a convoluted argument. Where am I now? 5? That was 5. The last item is that Moll is very much related to the world. That is, she is not a silent pilgrim alone in this world. There are a lot of people like her. She meets them, she joins with them. Her husbands may be included among the diversity of people whom she meets. But to all extent and purposes, what we have is a woman of the world a woman not divorced from the world, a woman having to accommodate to the circumstances of the world, and a woman who ultimately gains her fortune by the honest inheritance of her mother. Of course, she comes to England with a lot of money, but that could be lost. What she retains is the wealth her mother gives her, which gives her ultimate peace and livelihood in the new world. So if you want to conclude the novel, you may say that her ultimate life, her life of repentance and her life as an old woman in peace, is to some extent the rectification of the act of her bastardization by her mother. And to that extent, the novel achieves a degree of unity by bringing her full circle from her mother having been the cause of her circumstances to her mother having been her salvation in these circumstances. Now, if in fact we want to say that Moll Flanders has been on a spiritual voyage, then we may be hard-pressed to address that point completely, since I've just told you that her salvation is through her mother and not necessarily through her God. But if we want to, again, accommodate the recognition, or recognize, if we want to recognize that Moll Flanders has been tempted by the devil, and the devil has been defeated by these other forces of good, human nature, honest effort, new world purity, then indeed she has recovered herself in a world of plenitude. I'm going to mention the word plenitude. In the 18th century, the idea and concept of plenitude meant that for everyone there was enough at every level of life to enjoy the riches and the harvest of the spiritual world invoked in the material world. If you want to look, when you write your essays, as America as being the ultimate Eden for Moll Flanders, if Eden has been restored, then it is the restoration of the concept of plenitude, where each person at each level of his life, at each station of life, at each place in life, has enough to accommodate and ensure that the life will be productive and satisfying. Well, we're going to stop there with Moll Flanders, unless anyone wishes to add. Now, I've gone through the Greases. I've perhaps gone through 1/3 of what you yourself could find. If anyone could think of an episode under government, religion, economics, art and aesthetics, science and technology, education, or social behavior that I have ignored, please feel free to explore those as well as the items I have mentioned in dealing with Moll Flanders. The next novel you're going to read is a novel that you may think is not a novel. I had mentioned earlier when this semester began that the novel in the 18th century is somewhat amorphous. It doesn't have a shape. You can say that Pilgrims Progress is not a novel, or you can say it's an allegory. Moll Flanders may be a novel because it takes a woman through a number of tense episodes to her salvation. But Tristram Shandy, you're going to find nothing like it in the 18th century, and nothing like it really in the 20th century. It is a totally experimental novel. It's a novel that seems to violate all the rules of writing, because what we have is a man writing about himself. Tristram Shandy is writing his autobiography. First, let me tell you who wrote this novel so you get some idea what we're looking at. Tristram Shandy was written by Laurence Sterne. I want to get this up. He came from a long family of Anglican ministers. Richard Sterne was an archbishop who had been born in 1596. He was a high church royalist and a chaplain to Archbishop Laud during the Civil War. He provided funds to Charles I and was arrested by Cromwell. His grandfather, Simon Sterne, had 3 sons, Richard, Roger, and Jacques. Roger, the middle son, was an unsuccessful ensign in Flanders War, and the father of Laurence Sterne, born July 6, 1733. No, born November 24th, 1713, excuse me. Born in Clonmel in Tipperary in Ireland. It's rather unique and kind of interesting that most of the comic playwrights and comic novelists are Irish. Jonathan Swift was born in Ireland, who wrote Gulliver's Travels. Yeats was born in Ireland 200 years later. One of the reasons may be that the island suffers such misery and poverty that people must have a sense of humor to survive in Ireland. And Sterne, who writes a comic novel, much different from Moll Flanders, was born in Ireland. He entered Jesus College at Cambridge July 6, 1733, when he was 20, which is kind of late for youngsters to enter college. He earned his baccalaureate degree, and by 1737 he was already ordained a deacon, and by 1738 he was a vicar at Sutton near York, an appointment he held for over 20 years. Sutton was not far from York, which only had a population itself of 12,000 people, so he was a small-town clergyman in a small-town atmosphere. But he was a clergyman, he knew Latin, and you'll see how he uses Latin in Tristram Shandy. Now let's talk a little bit about this novel he wrote. Incidentally, Sterne, can I have this exhibit again? Sterne, in 1760, was a minister in Yorkshire. By 1762, he had contracted consumption, discharged blood from his lungs, and in 1768, he died at the age of 55. But toward the end of his life, he was writing one of the most imaginative novels in the history of the world. I'm going to tell you that when you read this novel, you're going to find something you've never seen before and something that's never been written since. It is an autobiographical novel, A man looks back on his life and wants to describe what it has been and why it has happened. And in 9 volumes, he covers only about the first 6 years of his life. Had he lived longer, he would have written 25 volumes and maybe gotten up to the age of 14. Tristram Shandy first came out, volumes 1 and 2, in December 1759 in York. In the 3rd and 4th volumes came out in 1761. Volumes 5 and 6 also in 1761, but in December, 11 months apart. Volumes 7 and 8 came out 4 years later. And the last volume, where we have The Love of the Widow Wadman and Uncle Toby explained, occurs in January 1767. So the novel actually took from 8 years to write. People only saw volumes as they came out, and they eagerly swallowed them up. They were looking for each volume to find out what next was happening to this young man, Tristram Shandy. You have the misfortune of being forced to read this book within a week, while Englishmen had 8 years in which to read it. Now, what are some of the central themes in Tristram Shandy? Frederick Carl, K-A-R-L, in a book called The Adversary Company, A-D-V-E-R-S-A-R-Y, The Adversary Company, comes up with a number of issues that he thinks are essential to Tristram Shandy. And I'm going to go over Frederick Carl's points because I think they're very, very good. The book has been reprinted in paperback under the title The 18th Century English Novel. And the first thing that Carl says this book is about conception. Now, one of the things about conception is that the author is conceiving how to write his story about his life. And so this has to do with, number one, the fact that he is conceptualizing a novel in many parts and trying to give you the various ideas of his existence. This is an autobiography where Tristram Shandy is writing about himself, although Lawrence Sterne is the actual writer. Along with conception is the idea of begetting. Now, Tristram Shandy knows the day on which he was gotten. He knows the day on which he was born. But on that fateful day, he knew his father always had 2 obligations. One was to wind the clock, to make sure the clock was working in the house once a month, and the other was to make love to his wife once a month. At the moment of Tristram's conception, his mother, instead of paying attention to him, turned to his father and asked, "Have you wound the clock yet?" So Tristram attributes all the problems of his life to the fact that his father and mother weren't entirely paying attention to him at the moment he was begotten, at the moment of his conception. And this is one of the things he tells us in Tristram Shandy. And we'll be talking about that. Now, to that extent, a lot of things happen incompletely. Tristram is born, but he feels that his parents don't pay attention to him. His father wants him to be named a certain word. He wants him to be named Trismegistus. But at the baptism, there's an interruption, and he's named by the wrong name. He interrupts his episodes, his story, to tell us other stories. And so as you read Tristram Shandy, there'll be a series of episodes about what is happening, And then you'll be distracted. Because Tristram's mind is governed by associational behavioristic techniques. One idea addresses another and addresses another. So if you're reading Tristram Shandy and you find, in fact, that he is distracted and that there is the interposition of new stories and new tales, it is part of this interruption. Because a person's mind never works in a straight linear fashion. You'll be talking to someone and then you remember something else and you go back over it. And then you remember something else. And someone interrupts you to tell you what he's thinking or she's thinking. And then you say, oh yes, I remember something I was doing in that respect. And you get far and far away from the subject. And that's what happens in Tristram Shandy. You're going to find yourself getting far away from the subject. What else do we have here? We have midwifery. Who is going to deliver Tristram when he is born? Well, his mother makes his father sign a contract. She doesn't like country doctors. She wants to go to the city and have Tristram born. So she writes into the marriage contract that Tristram is going to be born, that their son, I don't know, the name is not going to be Tristram, it's going to be something else, will be born, or their daughter will be born in London, where the great doctors are. But Mrs. Shandy has a false delivery, and the trip to London is for nothing. And when she comes back, Walter Shandy, her husband, feels that he has fulfilled his contractual obligation, and the next time she has labor pains, by God, she's going to deliver this child in the country where he wants the child delivered, and that's what happens. So again we have interruption, and we have the nature of birth. And to some extent, the whole idea of who's going to give birth, a midwife or a doctor, contrasts certain portions. Country versus the city. Nature versus nurture. That is, are we bred by the country, by natural elements, or is the city the place where people learn most? Do we develop naturally, or must we tutor people and train them to achieve their level of understanding? Do we follow the folk ways of the country, or do we live with civilized ways of existence? Other themes you find in Tristram Shandy. You find naming. How are people named, and where do they come from? We have a number of people in this novel who have interesting names. We have Tristram Shandy, who is, of course, the son. Walter Shandy, who is the father. Uncle Toby is the uncle who fought in the War of Flanders, and who was wounded, and who spends his time building fortifications, reliving his warrior days. We have the widow Wadman, who is looking for a husband, and thinks she has found it in Uncle Toby. And we have the doctor, called upon to deliver Tristram Shandy, Dr. Slop, who receives his bag of tools from Obadiah, the servant. But Obadiah, carrying them on a horse, was afraid the tools would fall out of the bag, and has tied so many knots to keep the bag from opening, that while Tristram is emerging from his mother's womb, the doctor, instead of ministering to his mother, is damning Obadiah for the knots and trying to get the bag untied so he can get the forceps. Which leads us to the next point. Catastrophes. When he was born, Tristram's nose is broken with the doctor's forceps. So even at birth, he has problems. These all become part of trying to understand what a person is when he is born at birth and how he survives this world. Now, if Pilgrim's Progress was an adventure where Pilgrim was looking for salvation, and if Moll Flanders was a woman led into sin who emerges redemptive, what is Tristram Shandy? Tristram Shandy is our first novel dealing with a person whose identity is shaped and unshaped by an unforgiving world where accident prevails and not a divine plan. And we'll see what happens because we're not going to find an easy plan in this work. One of the characteristics of this work that you're going to find is the concept of time. Now, this novel does not work in a regular time sequence. You'll find events at the beginning of the novel that are occurring in the year 1718. You'll find events in the middle of the novel that occurred in 1680. Because Tristram keeps going back and going back to recall the past. And he doesn't do it in a regular fashion. To some extent, you have the narrator's time. The narrator's time is what the narrator does when he takes you from one scene to the other. Then you have reading time, the time it takes you to read an episode. Sometimes you'll read an episode in 5 minutes. Sometimes it'll take you an hour. By the way, when you first start to read this novel, and some of you may have already, my suggestion to you is find yourself a long swath of time and sit down and read the first 100 pages nonstop. Even if it seems confusing, just read it nonstop. And don't go back to try to make sense out of it, because you may not easily be able to do that. Read it nonstop. Now, those of you who are watching this on cable TV, sitting on your bed with a hot toddy in your hand, box of popcorn in front of you, you're going to find yourself eating this popcorn more and more quickly as you become more and more frustrated reading this novel. So make sure you've got a big, big box of popcorn if you're watching this. And do not switch to the Rockets game if this is on while Rockets game is on, because you're going to miss this first 100-page swath that you've got to sweep through the way Tristram himself is sweeping through this novel. The character has a sense of time. Tristram knows when he was born, and he knows when his midwife was born. And one of the problems is to discover what is the relationship of everything to the whole. Because Tristram himself is trying to figure out how his life works. And he has great difficulty doing that. And since he's telling you the story, you may also find yourself equally frustrated by Tristram's lessons or by Tristram's message. Three more points that you have to know about when you look at Tristram Shandy. And let's just focus on these sheets here. Number one, this is a narration. It's a narration told by a person who is essentially unreliable. That is, we don't know whether Tristram Shandy is telling us the truth or telling us only what comes to his mind. And so when you read Tristram Shandy, you always have to realize that this is coming through the strange bias of someone who doesn't even know why everything that's happening to him is happening. And some of it is very unpleasant. But in our lives, we don't ask to be born, we only ask how to survive. And Tristram Shandy is one of those people who's trying to learn how to become a survivor. The next point is hobby horses. This book is about hobby horses. You know what a hobby horse is? A hobby horse is anything that you like to ride and ride hard and ride long that enables you to vent out your frustrations. Now, we all have our hobby horses. In Tristram Shandy, the hobby horse is Uncle Toby's desire to tell his story about the War of the Spanish Succession. And he's always building fortifications. When he falls in love with the widow Wadman, or he thinks that he may be enamored of her, she wants to know where he was wounded in the battle. She thinks that he's going to show her on a map where the Battle of Namur occurred. He's somewhat embarrassed. He feels when she asks him to show where he was wounded, she wants to see his scar. And his scar is in an embarrassing place for him because he was wounded in the groin. And we'll discover what happens when he tries to tell the widow Wadman where he was wounded. Other people have hobby horses. The Uncle Toby has his Tristopedia. He's decided he's going to come up with a very, very formal way of educating Tristram Shandy. He has mapped out Tristram's life from the very beginning. What kind of schools he's going to go to, how he's going to be named. He's going to keep this encyclopedia of his son's conduct and his growth and maturation. And to some extent, this book is a study of Locke's theory on education. Because on the one hand, it tells us a lot about what John Locke thought, and I'm going to talk next time about John Locke and how Tristram Shandy deals with John Locke's viewpoints. Those of you who are philosophers, those of you who have studied John Locke's essays on education and human understanding, may find yourself very much interested in how this novel accommodates John Locke. But at the same time it is a Lockean novel, it is a parody on John Locke. Because it says no matter how well you want to educate people, things don't quite turn out the way you think they will. This was written in the 18th century, but I'm thinking of Tolstoy's War and Peace, where Tolstoy tells us that nothing turns out the way you think it's going to turn out. That's why the generals are always asleep at planning sessions. They'll let their lower level generals plan the war and the colonels because they know that whatever they plan will not work out the way it's supposed to work out. Have I mentioned this before? Okay. There's a scene in War and Peace where an artilleryman keeps firing down off the mountain onto the French. And he has a small battery of about 5 men who are firing. He doesn't realize that the entire Russian army around him has retreated. All the other artillery batteries are gone. They felt for sure the French were going to move out and defeat themselves, so they retreated. Except for this one Russian who had no idea that the troops had retreated. And so he keeps firing down on the French. The French, in the meantime, know military strategy, and they know that if only one gun's firing on them, there'll be at least 8 other artillery pieces ready to fire on them if they start to move. So they stay put. And when the Russians realize that the French aren't advancing, they come back and they defeat them. Purely accidentally. And this is one of the things in Tristram Shandy. So much we want to plan, so much we want to work out, doesn't work out. That the whole Lockean philosophy, that if you plan the right education and give the people the right books and give them the right access to education, will give them an education, is proven to be an unfounded belief. The book does deal with love and romance. Walter Shandy and his wife are in love and have romance to the extent that they have these agreements. Uncle Toby and the widow Wadman form a romance. Uncle Toby's military attaché forms a romance with the widow Wadman's maid. When Slockenbergius comes to town, and we see this man with this enormous nose walking through the town, there are many people in the town who see romantic allusions or draw romantic comparisons with this man of a prodigious nature. And we'll talk about Slockenbergius, because Tristram Shandy is a novel that has more surprises and more unique occurrences than anyone could dream of. And so let me conclude this session by just reading a little bit from Tristram Shandy and getting you into that novel. Incidentally, Lawrence Tristram tells you how he's written his novel. Would everyone please look at this? These are the chapters of the book. This is page 333, in which he tells you how the novel is written. He starts out by expressing an idea and then falls into a digression. And he starts continuing with his idea, and another idea comes up. And so getting to the end of his novel is a very difficult thing. He says here, these are the 4 lines I moved through in trying to get to my first, second, and my first, second, third, and fourth volumes. Here's the first volume, second, third, and fourth. So when you read the novel, don't expect things to move in a linear plan. All right? Some of you write that way, by the way. Some of you talk that way, by the way. All right, let's take a few moments to start this novel. I wish, says Tristram Shandy, either my father or my mother, or indeed both of them, as they were in duty both equally bound to it, had minded what they were about when they begot me. Had they duly considered how much depended upon what they were then doing, that not only the production of a rational being was concerned in it, but that possibly the happy formation and temperature of his body, perhaps his genius and his very cast of his mind, and for aught they knew to the contrary, even the fortunes of his whole house might take their turn from the humors and dispositions which were then uppermost. Had they duly weighed and considered all this and proceeded accordingly, I am verily persuaded I should have made a quite different figure in the world from that in which the reader is likely to see me. The question is, how are you going to see Tristram Shandy? You're going to see him as an adult writing this book. You're going to see him as a child being born. You're going to see him as a procreative creature before birth. I mean, you're going to actually see him in the womb thinking about what's happening to him as the doctor is trying to bring him out. I know of only one other novel that deals in themes somewhat like this. It's a novel Philip Roth wrote. And the title escapes me at this very moment. But he urges, for example, that it might be a good idea for Richard Nixon to go back into the umbilical sac and to start things over again. And I'm not saying there's a political commentary, but there's only one novel that deals with the idea of birth or the return of birth, and that's the novel by Philip Roth and this. And Philip Roth is known for some wild novels in the 20th century, including Portnoy's Complaint. And Lawrence Stern is known for a wild novel in the 18th century, which is a Tristram Shandy. So we're going to conclude now. I'll give you an opportunity to finish Moll Flanders, those of you who haven't done it. And know that when you get to Tristram Shandy, you're going to visit a very challenging novel.